Welcome back, my quiver of capitalists, to AP Economics presented by Cobranomics, your all-American American history teacher, gold standard of economics, le champion of classical liberalism, and sensei of supply side, Professor G here. And today we have Unit 4 introducing the graphical representation of our economic indicators, the full employment graph, and Keynesian economics. How do we fix where we are in relation to where we should be, and all of the math that comes with that later in the unit. But first, let us introduce taking the Unit 3 economic indicators and creating a graphical visualization of them so that economists can essentially drive without using the front mirror, only the rearview mirror, meaning economists only have the data available to them in the rearview mirror that already happened months ago, 3 months ago. So how do they know where to go forward? How do they know what will happen when exogenous shocks happen? If the government uses fiscal policy, if the Federal Reserve uses monetary policy. It all gets traced back to this graph we are going to create. This is going to show us where we are based on our indicators in relation to where we should be, also based on our indicators. So let's take a look at the parameters, the two axes of our new graph, the full employment graph, and you'll really notice that it really is just a macroeconomic version of the supply and demand graph with the complexity of our indicators of the macroeconomy. Replacing price from our supply and demand graph is the price level, which is the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and the inflation rate. So we have price stability. The higher the price level, as we climb up the y-axis, that is the higher the CPI, and as the CPI increases, as we saw with Unit 3, so does the inflation rate. And here we have on the x-axis, we have real gross domestic product. And as the x-axis increases from 0 to outward, so too does real GDP. All of the money spent on newly produced, the dollar value spent on newly produced goods and services. But you'll notice that our third economic indicator, the unemployment rate, is missing from this graph. But not really, because we have GDP. And from GDP, we could assume the unemployment rate. Now I know what you're saying, Professor G, that when you assume, you make it doesn't matter what you think. This is what happens. The unemployment rate, we have real GDP increases. We could assume that the unemployment rate is decreasing because as we are producing more, we need the labor to make those products. And therefore, as we are adding labor, the unemployment rate is coming down. Inversely, as real GDP is decreasing, we could assume that the unemployment rate is increasing because as businesses cut back on production, as there is less spending on newly produced goods and services, we do not need the labor to produce those goods and services. So businesses are unfortunately laying people off as there is a decrease in spending. So therefore, as real GDP decreases, unemployment will increase. And real GDP is going to be our baseline, as we saw in Unit 3, how much is derived from the real GDP, which is why it is our x-axis. So, our full employment graph, despite having only 2 axes, has all 3 indicators. And sometimes the AP test will make you make those assumptions and connect the dots between them. So now let's take a look at our first aspect of our graph, our first curve of the graph, the aggregate demand curve. And also very importantly, kind of backtracking a little bit, we see that in terms of the supply and demand graph, how price level replaced price, real GDP replaces quantity. And it makes sense because the quantity of the goods in the market will aggregately, will in total become the total production value of those goods in the market. So really taking that microeconomic concept and now taking it into the whole macroeconomy. And representing the macroeconomy, aggregate demand aggregate meaning total, demand, spending in the economy. So we have total spending, but in the regular supply and demand graph, demand was just households. Here we have total spending of an entire economy. And our aggregate demand graph is downward sloped, and we'll take a look why. But first, let's take a look at the components of aggregate demand. Yes, it is households, but think about all of the other entities that spend money in an economy. So aggregate demand consists of four things: consumer spending, investment spending, businesses spending money on capital, real estate, and inventory, government spending, and net exports. And we notice that the components of aggregate demand are the same as the expenditure formula for real GDP. And that has to make sense because aggregate demand represents total spending, so too does real gross domestic product. So aggregate demand, same formula, same components as real gross domestic product, showing that the aggregate demand curve is very responsible for all of the spending in the economy. And here is all of these, so whereas the supply and demand was just households, in the macro economy, aggregate demand is now total spending, consumer spending, investment spending, government spending. And when we say government spending, we also are now going to include a very important key word, which is fiscal policy, which is the government's ability to spend and to tax. So that's the spending and taxing, the spending and taxing ability of the government. And net exports, the amount of money coming into the country, foreigners purchasing domestically made products versus the domestic economy purchasing foreign products. Now we're going to take a look at, even though aggregate demand and real GDP are the same formula, why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping compared to price level. So now we have the three reasons why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. And we really have to go back to Unit 3 when we talk about all of that swath of negative effects that inflation has on an economy, directly related to our ability to, as an economy, to purchase products all across the different sectors. Remember that chart from Unit 3, that where inflation just devastates all aspects of an economy. And it is the same thing here. The higher the price, and really it is that chart illustrated graphically. That's why graphs are so excellent in economics, and the visualizations of it. Remember, when in doubt, strike first and graph it out. So the price level, as the price level increases, as the CPI increases, as that inflation rate increases, the first effect it has is on consumer spending, that purchasing power effect. That, remember, that real, anything real, real income, real wage, real purchasing power, your real effects on your on income, on fixed income and savings. So real anything equals nominal minus inflation. So that as the price level is increasing, the inflation rate is eroding what we're supposed to be earning, and therefore what we are really able to spend is decreasing. So this is why, as the price level is higher, consumer spending is going to decrease. While we might be spending more money, we're not really buying more. So therefore, real GDP, remember, again, real is actually decreasing. We're spending more on less. So consumer spending will decrease as price level increases, as the inflation rate erodes our true purchasing power. 2 is the interest rate effect. And here this is the focus on investment spending, because when we think about investment spending, when businesses have to spend money on new capital and new factories, that costs millions, tens of millions of dollars. And investment spending is directly related to a business's ability to borrow from the bank. And if inflation is high, remember Fisher's hypotheses. Those interest rates are also going to be high because banks build in expected inflation on top of the real interest rate, so that when a bank gives out a loan and it's a fixed loan, and over the course of that loan, the borrower is paying inflated dollars back, Fisher's hypotheses protects the bank against that. Haha, you owe me money. Haha, here's inflated money. Haha, I already built it in for inflation. So Fisher's hypotheses, the nominal rate the bank gives out is built in higher already, anticipating that inflation, the expected inflation. So as the price level rises, banks are going to expect the price level to continue to rise, and the interest rate will rise as well as banks add expected inflation to their current real rate, and this will then discourage investment spending. Businesses are not going to take out massive loans at $10, $20 million on revolving credit in different banks if those interest rates are going to be so high, because that means they're going to have to pay millions more in interest over the course of the life of the loan. So as the price level increases, we will also see that is going to raise the interest rate, and therefore that is going to raise the nominal interest rate, and therefore we are going to see a decrease in investment spending. And the third reason why, so we're going to see aggregate demand, a movement along the left to the curve of the aggregate demand curve. Everything's staying along the curve. Price level is increasing, so same rules as demand. If the y-axis is changing, if price level is increasing, price level is increasing, GDP, which is called Y, and we see GDP is decreasing as we move into the left along the curve. And of course, all of these things are in reverse are true as well. As prices come down, this makes things more affordable. This will bring interest rates, the nominal interest rate down. And for our last one, the net export effect, this is essentially international consumer comparison. That if our prices are high, then we as consumers with free trade are going to look for products made elsewhere that are cheaper. And foreign countries, if they see that our prices are high, because they still have to convert their currency to pay for, into our currency to pay for our products, are not really going to want to do that because their currency isn't going to go as far in an inflated domestic currency. So domestic consumers are going to import more since our products are too pricey, and foreign consumers are going to export less from us also since our products are too pricey. Inversely, if we have a low price level, we would be perfectly fine buying domestic products. And foreigners, their dollar, their currency, when they convert to our dollar, can now has a greater purchasing power in our country. So inversely, if the price level is low, we are going to have a positive net exports effects as us as consumers purchase domestically and foreigners purchase more of our products. So this is the aggregate demand curve. This is our first component of the graph. Like I said, it takes the core of the regular demand curve and now makes it aggregate demand. The C plus I plus G plus X. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Remember, whether it is your money, your mind, or your body, invest hard, invest often, and no feelings. Money never sleeps. We'll see you next time.